You can't raise a child alone, Daniel Carter said, his voice flat and certain, as if he were stating a fact everyone else already understood. And Emily Carter stood there in the soft yellow light of the living room holding their newborn son against her chest, the baby wrapped in a pale blue blanket that still smelled faintly like the hospital. And for a moment nothing in her face changed, not her eyes, not her mouth, not even the way she breathed. Because the words didn't land like an argument, they landed like a verdict, something already decided, something he had rehearsed before saying out loud. And Daniel didn't look at the baby, not once, his attention fixed somewhere just past Emily's shoulder as if the conversation didn't require that level of detail. You don't even know what you're doing, he added, quieter this time, almost tired, like he was explaining something obvious, and the heater clicked on behind them, filling the silence with a low mechanical hum that made the room feel smaller, tighter, and Emily shifted her weight slightly, careful not to wake the child, her fingers adjusting the edge of the blanket with slow, precise movements, the kind you only make when you're trying to stay steady. And she didn't argue, didn't defend herself, didn't ask him what he meant, because something in the way he said it made it clear this wasn't a conversation he planned to have, it was a line he had drawn. And Daniel picked up his car keys from the kitchen counter, the metal catching the light for a second before disappearing into his palm. I'm going to stay at the apartment for a while, he said, already moving toward the door, already halfway out of the moment, and the baby stirred softly against Emily's chest, a small sound almost like a sigh, and she looked down for just a second, just long enough to see the tiny movement of his lips, the rise and fall of his breathing, and when she looked back up, Daniel was already at the door, one hand on the handle, his posture relaxed, like this was temporary, like this was manageable, like he hadn't just shifted the entire weight of their life onto her shoulders. Think about what I said, he added without turning around, and then he was gone, the door closing with a soft click that sounded quieter than it should have, and the house settled into a stillness that felt different from before, heavier somehow, as if the walls themselves were adjusting to the absence. And Emily stood there for a long moment without moving, the baby warm against her, the light above flickering once before stabilizing, and outside, a car passed slowly down the street, its headlights sliding across the living room window in a brief wash of white before disappearing again. And she didn't cry, didn't call after him, didn't even follow to the door, she just stood there, listening to the quiet, feeling the weight of what had been said, and after a few seconds she turned, walked into the kitchen, and set a bottle of formula on the counter with careful precision, her movements controlled, deliberate, as if each action mattered more now, as if each step was being recorded somewhere she couldn't see yet. And she adjusted, the baby in her arms again, her expression calm, almost distant, but there was something else there too, something that hadn't been there before, something Daniel hadn't noticed because he hadn't been looking, and he wouldn't understand it yet, not that night, not when he walked out convinced he was right, because what he said had sounded final, but it wasn't, and that was the part he got wrong. The house stayed quiet long after the door closed, the kind of quiet that made every small sound feel louder than it should have, and Emily moved slowly through it, not because she was unsure, but because she was measuring everything now, the distance from the kitchen counter to the sink, the weight of the baby in her arms, the steady rhythm of his breathing against her chest, and she set the bottle down beside the sink, unscrewed the cap, and poured the powder with careful precision, leveling it with the back of a knife the way the nurse had shown her just 3 days ago, and the smell of formula mixed with the faint scent of laundry detergent in the air, clean but slightly artificial, and she added warm water, testing it against her wrist the way she had been taught, waiting a second longer than necessary, as if confirming something no one else could see, and the baby made a small sound again, not quite a cry, more like a question, and she lifted him slightly, adjusting her hold with a quiet confidence that did not match what had been said to her earlier, and she did not rush, did not fumble, did not hesitate, she simply moved step by step, like someone who had already decided something important and did not feel the need to explain it out loud. And when she sat down at the small kitchen table, the chair made a soft scraping sound against the floor, the only interruption in the stillness, and she fed him slowly, watching the way his tiny hands curled and relaxed, the way his eyes stayed closed as if the world outside did not concern him yet, and for a moment, the entire house seemed to narrow down to just that small circle of light above the table, the bottle in her hand, and the steady, quiet act of keeping him alive. And she did not think about Daniel leaving, not directly, not in words, because that part had already settled somewhere deeper, somewhere colder, and instead she noticed other things, the unpaid bill tucked under a stack of mail near the doorway, the calendar on the wall still marked with a meeting she had cancelled months ago, the faint outline of a life she had stepped away from without fully closing the door behind her, and after the baby finished, she lifted him to her shoulder and waited, counting the seconds in her head, 1, 2, 3, until the soft sound came, small but certain, and she nodded once, not in relief but in acknowledgement, as if confirming a quiet fact, and then she stood, carried him into the bedroom, and placed him gently into the bassinet beside the bed, adjusting the blanket so it sat just below his shoulders, exactly the way the nurse had instructed, and she stayed there for a moment longer than necessary, her hand resting lightly on the edge, not touching him, just close enough to feel the warmth rising from his body, and the digital clock on the nightstand read 2:14 a.m. in soft green numbers, the kind that glow without lighting the room, and she turned away, walked back into the kitchen and reached for her phone, the screen lighting up her face in the dark, and she scrolled through her contacts without hesitation, stopping on a name she had not called in over a year, and for a second, her thumb hovered there, not because she was unsure, but because she was choosing the moment, and then she pressed call, holding the phone to her ear as it rang once, twice, 3 times, the sound sharp in the quiet house, and when the line connected, she did not waste time with explanations, she did not mention. Daniel did not mention what had been said, she simply spoke in a calm, even voice. Hi, this is Emily Carter. I am ready to come back. And there was a pause on the other end, just long enough to register surprise, and then a voice responded, careful, curious, asking if she was certain, and Emily looked around the kitchen at the bottle on the counter, the folded blanket on the chair, the small details of a life that had just shifted without warning, and she answered without raising her voice, yes, and that was all she said, because anything more would have made it sound like a reaction, and this was not a reaction, this was a decision, and somewhere across town, Daniel was likely settling into a different kind of quiet, one he believed he understood, one he thought he controlled, but he did not know about the call, he did not know about the shift already taking place, and he did not know that the version of Emily he had just left behind was no longer the one he would be dealing with next. The morning arrived without announcement, a thin gray light filtering through the kitchen window as if the day itself was uncertain about stepping inside, and Emily was already awake, sitting at the table in the same chair from the night before, a cup of coffee untouched in front of her, the surface still smooth and unbroken, and the baby monitor rested beside her phone, a soft static hum filling the quiet space between seconds, and she did not look tired, not in the way people expect. There were no heavy movements, no visible strain, only a stillness that felt deliberate, controlled, and when the monitor gave a faint shift of sound, she stood immediately, not rushed, not panicked, just precise, and walked back into the bedroom where the bassinet sat near the window, the pale morning light touching the edge of the blanket, and the baby stirred, small hands moving slightly, and she lifted him with the same steady motion as before, supporting his head without thinking, as if her body had already memorized the pattern overnight, and she did not speak to him, not yet. The room remained quiet except for the soft creak of the floor beneath her feet, and she carried him back to the kitchen, preparing another bottle with the same measured movements, leveling the powder, checking the temperature, pausing just long enough to confirm accuracy, and when she sat down, she glanced once at her phone, the screen lighting up briefly to show a missed message from an unknown number, likely related to the call she had made, but she did not open it, not yet, because the timing mattered, and she focused instead on feeding him, watching the small, consistent rhythm of his swallowing, the way his fingers curled against the fabric of her shirt, and outside, a car door slammed somewhere down the street, followed by the distant sound of an engine starting, normal life continuing without interruption, and when he finished, she placed him carefully in a small portable bassinet near the kitchen, keeping him within sight, and only then did she pick up her phone again, unlocking it with a calm, deliberate motion, and she read the message once, her eyes moving steadily across the screen, and then a second time, slower, confirming details, a meeting request, an offer to discuss terms, a position that had not been publicly listed yet, and she set the phone down without reacting, not outwardly, just a small shift in her posture, as if something had aligned exactly as expected, and she stood, walked to the counter, and began clearing the space, moving items aside, stacking papers, creating order where there had been none, and in the middle of it, she paused briefly, her hand resting on a folded envelope near the edge of the counter, something Daniel had left behind without noticing, and she opened it slowly, revealing a printed statement from one of his business accounts. Numbers lined up in neat columns, transactions that told a story without needing explanation, and she studied it for a moment longer than necessary, not because she was confused, but because she was confirming something she had already suspected. And then she folded it back exactly the way it had been, placing it down in the same spot, her movements careful, intentional, as if preserving the scene for later. And the baby made another soft sound, drawing her attention back immediately, and she turned, lifting him again with the same steady hands, holding him close as she walked toward the window, the morning light now stronger, filling the room with a pale clarity that left nothing hidden. And she looked outside for a moment, her reflection faintly visible in the glass, calm, composed, unchanged on the surface, but beneath that, something had shifted completely, and across town, Daniel was likely moving through his own morning, unaware of the small, quiet decisions already taking shape, unaware that the version of control he believed he had established was already beginning to slip, not in a dramatic way, not in a way he would notice yet, but in the kind of slow, precise movement that does not announce itself until it is far too late. And Emily adjusted the blanket around the baby once more, her voice low and steady when she finally spoke, not to anyone else, just to the quiet room. "We are fine." And the words did not sound like reassurance, they sounded like a statement of fact. The call came later that afternoon, not immediately, not rushed, but timed in a way that suggested intention, and Emily answered on the second ring, her voice even controlled, as if she had already anticipated the exact moment it would come. And the man on the other end introduced himself formally, his tone professional but careful, as if he understood there was more behind this conversation than a simple job inquiry. And he referenced her previous work without needing to explain it, campaigns she had built, accounts she had managed, decisions she had influenced quietly from behind the scenes. And Emily listened without interrupting, standing at the kitchen counter with one hand resting lightly beside the folded envelope, her gaze steady, her expression unchanged, and when he paused, she did not fill the silence right away. She let it sit for a second longer than necessary, then said, "I am available." Not enthusiastic, not hesitant, just clear, and the conversation shifted immediately into specifics, timelines, expectations, a meeting scheduled for the following morning downtown, a building she knew well without needing to look up the address. And when the call ended, she placed the phone down gently, not as someone overwhelmed, but as someone confirming the next step in a sequence already forming, and behind her, the baby monitor gave a soft sound, a small shift of movement that drew her attention instantly, and she turned, walked back into the bedroom and lifted him again, her movements unchanged, steady, practiced, as if nothing else existed beyond the immediate task in front of her. And the late afternoon light had begun to fade, casting long shadows across the walls, the kind that stretch quietly without asking for notice, and she adjusted the blanket around him, her fingers precise, careful, and for a moment she stood there, not moving, just observing, as if measuring the weight of what had already shifted in less than 24 hours. And then the front door opened without warning, the sound sharp against the stillness, and Daniel stepped inside like nothing had changed, his presence filling the space with a familiarity that felt slightly out of place now, and he set his keys down in the same spot as before, his movements casual, routine, as if he had only been gone for a few hours. And when he saw Emily standing in the hallway with the baby in her arms, he paused briefly, just long enough to register something different, something he could not quite name, and then he looked away first, clearing his throat as if resetting the moment. "I came to grab a few things," he said, his voice neutral, controlled, but there was a slight hesitation beneath it, something he did not fully understand yet. And Emily nodded once, not asking questions, not offering anything more, just acknowledgement, and she stepped aside slightly, giving him space without inviting him in further. And Daniel moved past her into the bedroom, opening drawers, pulling out clothes with quick, efficient motions, the sound of hangers sliding against the rod sharp in the quiet room. And he did not look at the bassinet, did not comment on the baby, did not ask how anything had been handled, as if avoiding that part would somehow confirm what he had already decided. And Emily remained in the hallway, her posture relaxed, her expression calm, watching without reacting. And after a few minutes, Daniel stepped back out, a small bag in his hand, his movements slower now, more deliberate, and he glanced at her again, this time holding the look a second longer, as if expecting something, a question, a complaint, a sign that she needed him, but it did not come, and the silence stretched just enough to make him shift slightly, uncomfortable in a way he had not anticipated. "You should think about what I said," he added, repeating the same line as before. But it did not carry the same weight now, not in this room, not in this moment, and Emily met his eyes briefly, her voice steady when she answered, "I did." And nothing more, and Daniel frowned slightly, a small crease forming between his brows, not because he understood the change, but because he felt it without being able to explain it, and he nodded once, as if ending a conversation that had never fully started, then turned and walked out again, the door closing behind him with the same soft click as before, but this time the sound did not linger, and Emily stood there for a second longer, then shifted her attention back to the baby, adjusting the blanket once more, her movements calm, controlled, and somewhere in the distance, the faint sound of traffic moved steadily along, the world continuing forward without pause, and Daniel still believed he had set the terms of what would happen next, but he had already missed the moment when that stopped being true. The next morning began before sunrise, the sky outside still a muted gray as Emily stood in front of the bathroom mirror, her reflection steady, unchanged, as if the last 24 hours had not altered anything visible on the surface, and the soft hum of the baby monitor carried faintly through the doorway, a quiet reminder of the responsibility that had not paused for anything, and she moved with purpose, brushing her hair back, tying it into a simple, clean style, choosing clothes that fit precisely, nothing elaborate, nothing careless, a dark blazer, a light blouse, and shoes she had not worn in over a year but still remembered exactly how they felt, and when she stepped into the kitchen, the air carried the faint scent of coffee from the machine she had set on a timer the night before, the small details already aligning into a routine that had not existed until now, and she prepared the baby's bottle first, always first, measuring carefully, checking the temperature, moving with the same controlled rhythm that had become second nature overnight, and when she lifted him from the bassinet, he stirred slightly, his small hand brushing against her wrist, and she adjusted her hold without looking down, as if her body already knew the exact balance required, and she fed him slowly, watching the clock on the wall without appearing rushed, timing everything, not because she was anxious, but because she understood that precision now mattered in ways it had not before, and once he was settled again, she placed him into the car seat near the door, securing the straps with deliberate care, checking each one twice, not out of doubt, but out of habit she was building in real time. And the morning light had begun to stretch across the floor, pale and clean, revealing every surface, every detail, and she took a moment to look around the house, not with attachment, not with hesitation, but with clarity, as if she were seeing it for what it actually was for the first time. And then she picked up her bag, her phone, and the folded envelope from the counter, slipping it inside without pause, and stepped outside into the cool air, the kind that sharpens everything, and her car sat exactly where she had left it, a quiet, reliable presence under the soft glow of the streetlight, and she secured the baby in the back seat, adjusted the mirror once, and got into the driver's seat, her hands resting lightly on the steering wheel for a second before turning the key, and the engine started smoothly, the low vibration grounding the moment, and she did not play music, did not fill the silence, she simply drove, the streets gradually coming to life around her, other cars appearing, traffic lights shifting from blinking yellow to steady green, the city waking up in its usual, predictable way, and when she arrived downtown, the buildings rose around her in clean lines of glass and steel, familiar and distant at the same time, and she parked in a structured garage, the echo of her footsteps sharp against the concrete as she stepped out, the sound of her heels measured, controlled, and she lifted the car seat from the back, adjusting her grip with quiet confidence, and entered the building through the revolving door, the cool air inside carrying the faint scent of polished floors and filtered air, and people moved around her in suits and pressed shirts, conversations low and efficient, and no one looked twice at her, not yet, and she approached the reception desk, her voice calm when she gave her name, and the receptionist paused for just a second, recognition flickering across her face before she picked up the phone, and within moments, a man in his late 50s approached, his expression professional but attentive, and he extended his hand, introducing himself, his tone carrying a subtle shift, one that suggested he knew exactly who she was and what she had done before, and Emily shook his hand without hesitation, her grip steady, her posture relaxed, and he glanced briefly at the baby, then back at her, not questioning, not commenting, simply noting it as part of the situation, and he gestured toward the hallway, inviting her to follow, and as she walked beside him, the sound of her steps remained even, unhurried, and behind her, the door closed softly, sealing off the outside world, and somewhere across town, Daniel was likely beginning his own morning unaware of where she was, unaware of what had already started, still holding on to the version of her that no longer existed, because while he believed he had defined her limits, he had not been there to see how quickly she had already moved beyond them. The hallway outside the conference room was quiet in a controlled way, the kind of silence that came from soundproof walls and measured conversations behind closed doors, and Emily followed a few steps behind the man as he led her down the polished corridor, her pace steady, the soft click of her heels evenly spaced, and the baby remained calm in the carrier, barely stirring, as if the shift in environment did not disturb him at all. And when they reached the glass door at the end, the man paused, his hand resting briefly on the handle before turning to her with a look that was more deliberate now, more aware, as if whatever he had seen in her file had just aligned with the reality in front of him. And he opened the door, gesturing for her to enter first, and inside, the room was larger than necessary, a long table, a screen mounted on the far wall, sunlight filtering through tall windows that overlooked the city, and 3 other people were already seated, their attention shifting toward her the moment she stepped in, their expressions professional but alert, and Emily did not hesitate. She moved to the chair offered to her, set the carrier down carefully beside it, adjusting the angle so the baby remained comfortable, and then she sat, her posture straight, her hands resting lightly on the table, and for a second no one spoke, not out of uncertainty, but because something about the moment required a reset, a recalibration of expectations. And then one of them, a woman in her 40s with a sharp, composed presence, leaned forward slightly, her voice calm but direct. "We did not expect you to come in person this soon," and Emily met her gaze without shifting. "I did not expect to either," she said, her tone even, and the room absorbed that answer without pushing further, and the man who had brought her in took a seat near the end of the table, opening a folder in front of him, and the conversation began, not with introductions, not with formalities, but with specifics, past performance, strategic decisions, campaigns that had shifted market positions in measurable ways, and as they spoke it became clear that Emily was not catching up, she was leading, her responses precise, her explanations concise, as if the time away had not dulled anything but had instead sharpened her focus, and occasionally, the baby made a small sound, a quiet shift that did not disrupt the flow, and Emily would adjust slightly, one hand moving instinctively to steady the carrier without breaking eye contact or losing her place in the discussion, and no one commented on it, not directly, but the absence of reaction became its own acknowledgement, and the woman across from her studied her more closely now, not just listening to the answers, but observing the way she delivered them, the control, the clarity, the lack of hesitation, and after a while she closed her notebook, leaning back slightly. "You built systems here that we are still using," she said, not as a compliment but as a statement of fact, and Emily nodded once. "They were designed to last," she replied, and there was a brief pause, a subtle shift in the room as if something had just been confirmed, and then the conversation turned not to whether she could return, but how, terms, structure, authority, and the man at the end of the table slid a document toward her, not a standard offer, something more tailored, more deliberate, and Emily glanced at it briefly, her eyes moving across the key sections without stopping, and then she placed her hand on the page, not signing, not yet, just anchoring the moment, and she looked up, her voice calm. "I will need flexibility," she said, and the woman across from her nodded immediately, as if that had already been anticipated. "You will have it," she replied, and again, no one questioned the condition, no one negotiated it down, and that was the part that mattered, not the words themselves, but how easily they were accepted. And outside the building, the city continued its steady movement, unaware of the small shift taking place inside that room. And across town, Daniel was moving through his own day, likely confident in the structure he believed he had left behind, unaware that in less than 48 hours, Emily had already stepped into a position he did not know existed, a position that did not require his approval, his presence, or his understanding. And as the meeting continued, Emily remained composed, focused, her attention on the details that mattered, but beneath that, there was something else, something quieter, something that had not yet been revealed, because this was not just about returning to work, and it was not just about proving him wrong, and that was the part Daniel would not see coming. When the meeting ended, no one rushed to stand, no one reached for polite closing remarks, and that was the first signal that something had shifted beyond a normal discussion. And Emily gathered her things slowly, not out of hesitation, but because there was no urgency in her movements, and the man who had brought her in stepped forward again, his posture more attentive now, as if recalibrating his understanding of who she was within the structure of the company, and he held the door open. Without speaking, and she nodded once as she passed, the baby still quiet in the carrier, undisturbed by the change in pace, and the hallway outside felt different than before, not physically, but in the way people looked up now, brief glances that lingered a second longer, recognition beginning to surface in small, subtle ways, and Emily walked through it without acknowledging any of it, her focus forward, her steps measured, and when she reached the elevator, she pressed the button once and waited, her reflection faintly visible in the brushed metal doors, composed, controlled, unchanged on the surface, and when the doors opened she stepped inside alone, the space closing around her with a soft hum, and for a moment, there was only the quiet movement downward, the subtle shift of gravity, the reflection of her own face looking back at her, and she did not smile, did not adjust her expression, she simply watched, as if confirming something internal rather than external. And when the elevator reached the lobby, she stepped out into the open space, the sound of footsteps, low conversations, and distant phones creating a steady background noise that felt almost distant, and she moved through it with the same calm precision, exiting through the glass doors into the late morning light, the city now fully awake, traffic flowing, people moving with purpose, and she walked to the parking structure, her pace unchanged, her grip steady on the carrier, and when she reached her car, she placed it gently in the back seat, securing the straps without looking twice, her hands moving automatically, and then she paused for a second before getting in, her hand resting on the door handle, her gaze fixed somewhere ahead, not unfocused, but directed at something beyond the immediate moment, and then she opened the door, sat down and closed it quietly, the interior of the car enclosing her in a familiar stillness, and she placed her hands on the steering wheel, not starting the engine right away, just sitting there as the outside world moved past in reflections across the windshield, and her phone buzzed once in the cup holder, a message appearing on the screen, and she glanced at it briefly, a confirmation, a follow-up, terms already being prepared, and she did not respond immediately, she let it sit, allowing the moment to settle completely before moving forward, and then she started the engine, the low vibration grounding her again, and pulled out of the space with smooth, controlled motion, merging into the flow of traffic without hesitation, and across town, Daniel sat in his office, his desk arranged neatly, his computer screen filled with numbers and projections that had always made sense to him, and he leaned back slightly in his chair, his phone resting face down beside him untouched, and there was a brief moment where he glanced at it, not because he expected a call, but because something felt slightly off, a subtle shift he could not name, and he frowned faintly, then returned his attention to the screen, dismissing the feeling as quickly as it came, and back on the road, Emily drove steadily, her movements precise, her attention focused, and as she turned onto her street, the familiar houses lined up in quiet rows, unchanged, as if nothing had happened, and she parked in the driveway, the engine idling for a second before she turned it off, and the silence returned immediately, softer this time, less heavy, and she stepped out, lifted the carrier and walked back toward the house, her steps calm, controlled, and as she reached the front door, she paused briefly, her hand resting on the handle, and inside, everything remained exactly as she had left it, the same furniture, the same light, the same quiet, but it did not feel the same, not anymore, and she opened the door, stepped inside, and closed it behind her with a soft, deliberate motion, and somewhere between that meeting and this moment, something had fully settled into place, not loud, not dramatic, but final in a way that did not require confirmation, because Daniel still believed he had defined the limits of what she could do, but he had not seen what happened when she stopped explaining herself. The house felt different that evening, not quieter, not louder, but settled in a way that suggested something had shifted beneath the surface, and Emily moved through it with the same calm precision she had carried all day, placing the baby gently into the bassinet in the living room while the last light of the afternoon stretched across the floor in long, pale lines, and she did not turn on the television, did not reach for music, she allowed the silence to remain, controlled, intentional, and she walked into the kitchen, setting her bag down on the counter, pulling out the folded envelope she had taken earlier, placing it carefully beside her phone, aligning both objects as if they belonged to the same sequence of decisions, and she opened the envelope again, slower this time, her eyes moving across the printed statements with more attention, tracing the patterns in the numbers, the transfers, the timing, and there was no confusion in her expression, only recognition, as if the pieces had already been forming before she ever saw them laid out this clearly, and she folded it again exactly as before, returning it to the counter without hesitation, and behind her the baby shifted, a soft sound breaking the stillness, and she turned immediately, lifting him with the same steady motion, holding him close as she walked toward the window, the glass reflecting the dimming sky outside, and for a moment she stood there, not thinking, not questioning, just observing, as if confirming the shape of everything that was now in motion. And then the front door opened again, not abruptly, not loudly, but enough to shift the air in the room, and Daniel stepped inside once more. His movements slower this time, more measured, as if he had not expected to return so soon but had not been able to stay away either, and he closed the door behind him. His gaze landing on Emily immediately, then dropping briefly to the baby before returning to her face, and there was a pause, a small one, but long enough to register that something had changed, even if he could not define it yet. "I forgot a few things," he said, his tone neutral, but there was a slight edge to it now, something less certain than before, and Emily nodded once, not moving from where she stood, not offering space this time, just acknowledging the statement without inviting anything further, and Daniel walked past her into the kitchen, his eyes catching the envelope on the counter for a brief second before shifting away, too quickly to be accidental, and he opened a cabinet, then another, his movements less efficient than earlier, as if his attention was divided, and the silence between them stretched again, but this time it carried something different, not emptiness but pressure, and after a moment he spoke again, not looking at her directly. "You should not be making decisions right now," he said, his voice lower, controlled but lacking the certainty it had before, and Emily remained still, her expression unchanged, her voice calm when she answered. "I am not reacting," she said, and that was all, and Daniel turned then, fully facing her, his brow tightening slightly. "Then what are you doing?" he asked, and for the first time there was something close to a question in his tone, not authority, not dismissal but uncertainty, and Emily held his gaze for a second longer than necessary, not challenging, not defensive, just steady, and then she looked down briefly at the baby in her arms before answering. "I am adjusting," she said, her voice even, and the words settled in the room in a way that did not invite further explanation, and Daniel frowned slightly, as if trying to interpret something that did not fit his expectations, and he glanced again at the counter, at the envelope, at the phone beside it, small details that had not been there in the same way before, and he picked up his bag, his movements slower now, more deliberate, and when he spoke again his voice had shifted just slightly. "You should call me if you need anything," he said, but it sounded less like an offer, and more like something he felt he was supposed to say, and Emily nodded once, not confirming, not denying, just acknowledging the statement, and Daniel hesitated for a second, his hand resting on the back of the chair, as if considering whether to say something else, but nothing came, and he turned, walking toward the door again, and as he reached it, he paused briefly, not turning back, just standing there for a moment before stepping out, the door closing behind him with the same soft click, but this time it echoed slightly longer, and Emily remained where she was, her posture unchanged, her expression calm, and after a few seconds she walked back to the kitchen, setting the baby down gently, and she picked up her phone, unlocking it with a deliberate motion, opening the message thread from earlier, and this time she responded, her fingers moving with quiet certainty across the screen, confirming the terms, the timeline, the position, and when she finished, she set the phone down, not looking at it again, and she reached for the envelope one more time, holding it for a second before placing it back exactly where it had been, and the room settled into silence again, but it was no longer the same silence from before. It was structured, controlled, and somewhere in that stillness, the shape of what came next had already been decided, and Daniel still believed he had time to understand it, but he had already fallen behind. The next few days did not announce themselves as important. They arrived quietly, one after another, each one structured, deliberate, and Emily moved through them with the same controlled rhythm she had established from the first night, waking before the light fully settled into the room, preparing the bottle, checking the temperature, holding the baby with steady hands that no longer needed to think about the motion, and then dressing with the same precision, the same calm focus, stepping back into a routine that looked effortless from the outside but had been rebuilt piece by piece in silence. And each morning she left the house with purpose, the car moving through familiar streets that now felt slightly different, not because the world had changed, but because she had, and at the office, the shift became clearer, not loud, not announced, but visible in the way people adjusted around her. Meetings that had once been optional now centered on her input, Conversations that had once happened around her now paused until she spoke, and she did not fill those moments unnecessarily. She listened, she measured, and when she spoke it was direct, precise, leaving no space for doubt or interpretation, and the baby became part of that rhythm without disruption. Quiet, present, a constant reminder of what Daniel had underestimated, and no one questioned it, not because it was expected, but because it worked, and that was the only thing that mattered. And by the end of the week, the structure had already begun to shift in ways that would not be easily reversed, responsibilities redirected, decisions flowing through her without resistance, and somewhere within that, the envelope on her kitchen counter remained exactly where she had left it, untouched, but not forgotten. And on the third evening Daniel returned again, this time without explanation, without a stated reason, and when he stepped inside, the house did not react the way it had before. The silence did not shift, the air did not tighten, it simply absorbed him, and he stood there for a second longer than usual, his eyes moving across the room, noticing the small changes that had not been there before, the organized counter, the absence of clutter, the quiet order that suggested control rather than adjustment. And Emily was in the kitchen preparing another bottle, her movements steady, uninterrupted, and she did not look up immediately. She finished what she was doing first, placing the bottle on the counter, checking it once, and then she turned, meeting his gaze with the same calm expression she had carried all week, and Daniel hesitated just slightly before speaking. "You have been busy," he said, and it was not a question, not exactly, but it lacked the certainty he had relied on before, and Emily nodded once. "Yes," she said, nothing more, and the simplicity of the answer seemed to unsettle him more than anything else, and he stepped further into the room, his attention shifting briefly to the baby, then back to her, as if trying to reconcile something that did not match the version of events he had expected. "I heard from someone at the office," he added, his tone more careful now. "They said you were back." And there was a pause after that, a space where he might have expected explanation, justification, something to place him back into the center of the narrative, but it did not come, and Emily picked up the bottle, walking past him with quiet confidence, her focus already redirected, and she sat down, feeding the baby with the same steady rhythm as before, not acknowledging the shift in his tone, not adjusting her pace, and Daniel remained standing, his posture less certain now, his presence no longer filling the space in the same way, and after a moment, he moved to the counter, his hand brushing lightly against the envelope without picking it up, his eyes lingering on it for just a second longer than before, and then he looked at her again. "You should have told me," he said, and this time it sounded closer to a complaint than a statement, and Emily did not look up immediately. She finished the motion she had started, adjusting the baby's position, ensuring he was settled, and only then did she meet his gaze, her expression calm, unchanged. "You did not ask," she said, her voice even, and the words landed in a way that did not invite argument, did not create space for it, and Daniel opened his mouth slightly as if to respond, but nothing came. And the silence that followed was different from before, not empty, not uncertain, but final in a way that did not require agreement, and after a moment, he looked away, his attention shifting to the room again, to the small details he no longer recognized as his, and he nodded once, almost to himself, before stepping back toward the door, and this time when he left, he did not pause, did not offer another line, did not repeat what he had said before, and the door closed behind him with the same soft click. But it carried no weight at all, and Emily remained seated, her focus on the baby, her movement steady, and after a few seconds, she spoke quietly, not to fill the silence but to mark it. "We are not waiting anymore." And the words settled into the room with a clarity that did not need to be explained, because the shift had already happened, and Daniel would only understand it when there was nothing left for him to change.